China has dumped $150 billion of U.S. Treasuries since January of 2022. Is it a prelude to war? Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today, we're going to be talking about China is dumping U.S. Treasuries. And what the question is, why? They had about $1 trillion worth. Now they're down to about $860 billion worth. Are they drawing down their treasuries? Are they trying to topple the dollar as the world's reserve currency? Could this be a prelude to war in the wider region there? Former President Donald Trump, I think, was raising a lot of eyebrows just 3 days ago when he was writing on Truth Social World War III. And that was all it was. Is he referring to Ukraine, what's going on with China and Taiwan right now? Here he provides a little bit more context. He says, quote, "Could somebody please explain to Biden that MAGA means make America great again?" Believe it or not, he doesn't know that. He also doesn't understand that we are now, quote, a failing nation, a nation in decline. All of this was self-imposed by people who don't have a clue. We are losing our currency standard and will end up in World War III with these vicious but very stupid people in charge. They are only good at disinformation and cheating. And I was looking at the military exercises that China was conducting around Taiwan, where they were encircling the island with its navy. And I also wanted to take a look at this question of dumping treasury bonds. If you look at the latest data from the U.S. Treasury, you'll note that China was at $1.03 trillion worth of treasuries in January of 2022. But then it's been drawn down. In February, it was down to 1.02, then 1.01 in March, 967 billion in April, 951 in May, 938 in June, 939 in July, 938 in August, 900 in September, 877 October, 870 November, 867 in December, and then 859 in January of 2023. And you have to go all the way back to about 2009 to get to the point where they were that low in terms of their treasury holdings. When it was about 894 in December of 2009, and about they came up about above $900 billion in June of 2009. So they are at a level of U.S. Treasuries holdings that have not been seen for more than a decade after really, really building it up. It actually peaked in 2013 at about 1.3 trillion, 1.316 trillion in November of 2013 rather, was when they had their peak. And so this is a significant drawdown of a very significant decrease, about 16.8% in the past year alone. But when you consider the total decrease, it's about 34.7% decrease from their 1.3 trillion clip at November of 2013. And the recent shift comes as interest rates are rising in the U.S. in a bid to combat inflation after we printed more than $6 trillion for COVID. You see right here, we were at about 15.4 trillion on the M2 money supply. And then we peaked up at about 21.6 or 21.7 trillion by May of 2022. And it's actually been coming down, which is actually not such a great sign if you're looking for decrease of money supply. Usually that's going to happen at a time of recession or depression, where the money supply is actually being drawn down. So you might expect to see a little deflation coming into the picture. We see that the Bureau of Labor Statistics just came out with the latest inflation reading. It's down to 5% now over the past 12 months. It had peaked at 9.1% annualized in June of 2022. But coming back to the China story here, the catalyst for interest rates rising, though, was actually Russia invading Ukraine. The US Federal Reserve had not started hiking rates until about February, March of 2022, after the invasion occurred. But that was at a point where inflation was already up at 7.5%. They could have been hiking interest rates all throughout 2021. When, especially once it got above like 3, 4, 5%, that would have been a time for the Fed to say, hey, we're having an inflation problem here. We just printed $6 trillion. Maybe we need to soak up some of that additional money supply that we created for COVID. The economy has reopened much faster than we had intended. Now, amid the war in Ukraine, there was a flight to safety as the dollar temporarily strengthened as investors and financial institutions were benefiting from the higher yields. But the U.S. has still kept U.S. Treasuries rates at about 3.4%. So it's still below that of the inflation rate. It was 6% when I wrote this piece, but it's at 5%. But still, Treasuries are trading below that of the inflation rate. So you're still losing money if you're buying Treasuries right now. So I don't think the full plunge into Treasuries that you normally see in a recession has necessarily happened yet. As inflation gets below that of the yields, interest rates will begin to drop, but unemployment usually rises too as inflation is dropping historically, prompting a further flight to safety, usually away from equities and into things like gold and treasuries. This is the final strengthening of the dollar that usually signals that a recession is at hand. And we've looked at this in the past, but this is a chart that shows the red line is interest rates dropping historically since the 1980s when they were peaking. And then the purple and green and blue line is actually the strengthening and weakening of the dollar on an annualized basis. And what you'll notice is these gray lines are recessions, and that there's usually a very strong dollar that signals where you are when the recession's beginning. There's a final strengthening of the dollar. We see it here in the 82, 83 recession, not so much in the 91 recession, but yes, a strengthening of the dollar in the 2001 recession, certainly in the 2008 recession, 2009 recession. There's a massive strengthening of the dollar. And there was also a peak of the dollar during the COVID recession of 2020, as temporary as it was. But this final plunge into the dollar, this great strengthening of the dollar that occurs in a recession, occurs because everyone and their mother, central banks all over the world, financial institutions, tend to buy dollar denominated assets or things like gold in a flight to safety. Why? Because equities markets are crashing usually at that point. When you're getting a recession, you could see a big correction in the stock market. And so you go into something where think you're going to get a better yield. So if inflation were to get back down below 2%, then suddenly a 3% bond doesn't look so bad. You'll actually be beating inflation in that sense. From there, with the recession, the Fed will usually begin cutting interest rates as inflation falls. This frees up credit for banks to begin lending again at lower rates. Consumers will respond to the relatively lower rates, but usually only after clearing their debt from the prior cycle. The past two cycles, they've used the Fed near 0% interest rates and then further engaged in the practice of quantitative easing, particularly after the financial crisis. And purchasing treasuries with cash, thereby incentivizing banks to buy something more productive than the government bonds. So you don't want them to stay in bonds forever, even if they need to get their balance sheets in order. But once as the Fed is soaking it up, they're either lowering interest rates to say, yeah, you don't want bonds, go back and buy more equities now. This will typically, thaw out markets faster. Now, this is all context. When owners of treasuries are selling more than they are buying, interest rates can rise. And when they buy more than they are selling, interest rates could fall. But could China really impact this process all that much? And I point to a piece here from 2019, the South China Morning Post, Karen Young. She's writing about this. Let me pull up the piece here. Will China use its 1.2, this was back in 2019, 1.2 trillion of US debt as firepower to fight the trade war? Fears are mounting among investors. And then there's a threat here, implicit or explicit, however you want to read it, if she represents China or not. Quote, China could strike back against Trump's tariffs then by dumping its vast holdings of US government debt. Flooding the market with treasuries would push US bond prices, push down US bond prices and cause the yields to spike. That would make it much more costly for US companies and consumers to borrow, in turn depressing America's economic growth. Now, this is something I think of a paper tiger or paper dragon in the case of China, in terms of how much firepower do they really have to shrink or to hurt US Treasury markets. They've actually drawn down by about 150 billion from more than 1 trillion down to 860 billion. But US Treasury markets are still functioning. And the question is, do they own enough of the debt to really sink it? Out of a $31 trillion debt, now all they own is 860 billion. Is that enough? Is this just a fantasy? In theory, dumping dollar denominated assets should weaken the dollar, resulting in higher inflation and interest rates. But what typically happens is that eventually increases the incentive to purchase US bonds. The real question, again, is firepower. In 2013, they had a 1.3 trillion. China was the single largest debt holder back in 2013, owning 10.7% of the then 12.2 publicly traded debt. The total debt at that point was $17.2 trillion, but that includes non-marketable treasuries held by Social Security and Medicare. That was China's high watermark, whereas today the debt is much larger now. And with just 860 billion of treasury, China owns just 3.5% of the 24.6 trillion of the publicly traded debt. So is it a paper dragon? They went from 10% or nearly 11% of the publicly traded debt all the way down to 3.5% of the publicly traded debt. Can they upset or overturn or cause a run on US treasuries if all they own is 3.5% of it? Simply put, they could sell all of that tomorrow. Yes, it would be disruptive. Yes, interest rates would temporarily jump, but we're not Greece. We can print our own money. You see the financial crisis, the sovereign debt crisis in Europe in the 2010s was predicated in Greece, but also in much larger extent, Italy and Spain, because they were dependent upon the European Central Bank to help finance its debt. And the ECB was trying to impose fiscal controls on these countries, saying, hey, you either cut your spending or raise taxes or do something, or otherwise we're not going to lend you this money. And so interest rates would rise. Whereas in the United States, we're far more sovereign. We're not a member of the European Union, and we're not even dependent on China to finance the debt if all they own is 3.5%. If you just look at the Federal Reserve balance sheet right now, these are factors. This is the H.4.1 balance sheet by the Federal Reserve, factors affecting reserve balances of depository institutions. The Federal Reserve owns $5.3 trillion of US Treasury debt right now, and China only has 860 billion. So even if they dump the 860 billion, if they can print $5.3 trillion to buy US Treasuries, well, who's to say that they couldn't just print another 860 billion to buy whatever China was dumping and to offset that? Of course, that's what they would do. So I think this is kind of an empty threat by China that, oh, they're going to dump the debt and everyone's worried about the dollar losing its world reserve currency status. And now that's possible, but it would take more than just China doing a run on treasuries. I don't think that's a really plausible scenario. It seems kind of far-fetched. But if you want to go there, it would take other foreign actors as well if they all attempted to do this at the same time in a bid to weaken the U.S. economic and financial system. And then you look at who owns the debt right now, who would help them in this endeavor. Japan is at 1.1 trillion. The United Kingdom owns about 670 billion. Belgium, 330 billion. Luxembourg, 320 billion. Switzerland, 290 billion. Cayman Islands, 285 billion, Canada, 250 billion, and on down the line. All told, there's about $7.4 trillion worth of treasuries that are held overseas. And that's actually a smaller percentage of the national debt than was seen in the past. In December of 2008, foreign central banks and financial institutions owned about 3 trillion, or about 31% of the national debt. But in January of 2023, that number has fallen, actually, the percentage of the debt that they own down to 23.5%. So if anything, the time to have had a run on treasuries maybe would have been around the time of the financial crisis, when foreign governments owned a much greater share of the national debt. But they've gone from 31% down to less than 24%. China's gone from 11% down to about 3.5%. So that's I think is, it's not as much of a threat as it used to be. That's for sure. If the goal was to stockpile treasuries only to dump them at the end, it seems much of the window passed after the financial crisis. Now the risk is actually concentrated in U.S. financial institutions, retirement funds, and other mutual funds, with its share of treasuries rising from 17% in 2008, or 1.7 trillion, to a massive $12 trillion, or 38% today. That makes U.S. financial institutions, U.S. retirement funds, mutual funds, the largest single shareholder of the national debt. Now, another factor to consider is that as the dollar weakens because dollar assets are dumped, other currencies like the yuan would actually strengthen. So, what trade exporters typically do to intervene in US currency markets, so called currency manipulation, is actually buy up treasuries, thereby dumping yuan in the case of China, and weakening the yuan in a bid to make exports to the United States much, much cheaper. So this is kind of like a reverse tariff. They can lower the cost of goods that they sell in the United States simply by the act of buying U.S. treasuries, but they're not the only ones who do it. Japan does the same thing, South Korea, and so forth. So by dumping treasuries and weakening the dollar, they would be making Chinese exports to the United States more expensive. So that's why I ask, is this actually a prelude to war? Because maybe what they're trying to do is not necessarily topple the dollar as the world's reserve currency, but maybe just get as much of the 860 billion, it was 1 trillion, back prior to doing something like invading Taiwan, which I think is always an ever present in the context of geopolitical situation, particularly in the post World War II era, after China, the Chinese Communist Party took over China. And then the war between the nationalists and the communists fought to a standstill. And we've always protected Taiwan. We've always guaranteed their security. So if China were to ever go into Taiwan, we would probably be defending it militarily, I would think. That's certainly the promise that's been made over the years. Meaning the question really boils down to trade. Does China still want to maintain its trade advantage with the United States? If so, failingly attempting to crash the dollar might actually be counterproductive if it temporarily weakens the dollar, since U.S. made goods would become relatively cheaper in the United States compared to Chinese goods. On the other hand, a complete divestiture of treasuries by China after sanctions were levied on Russia following the invasion in Ukraine could indeed be a prelude to war, indicating Beijing wanted to get back as much of their money as possible. And with the Chinese Navy encircling Taiwan, since one of the first things the U.S. would do is simply end all payments to Chinese holders of the debt. There would be sanctions on Chinese companies. So they could lose a huge chunk of that money that they lent to us if they were to go into Taiwan. We would just say, we're not paying you back. Sorry, you're violating international law. And oh, by the way, we're going to defend Taiwan, meet the U.S. Navy here in the South China Sea. As always, it's about what sort of future Beijing wants for itself and its people. It appears they can have the benefits of trade with the United States, or they can have war, but we're not going to trade with somebody who's trying to invade and take over Taiwan. And I wanted to, that's pretty much the piece right there. I wanted to go to the comments and see what you guys are saying. No, it seems like the chat's really buzzing here. This is really a very serious situation. So I appreciate everyone who's tuning in today. Thank you so much for that. Hit that subscribe button. Let's see. So Frederick Trammell says, getting rid of it, gonna be worthless soon, referring to the dollar. Okay. Um, Biden and the administration must go. They are destroying America. Sam Abbo, thank you for that comment. Here we go. Michael Luzuski, sorry if I mispronounced that. Buy and invest America. We have to get rid of enough of China broken down. um, okay, in our large fields, our land fields. Let's see here. Pay attention, Joe Brandon Biden, James Pizzo. Thank you, James. Frederick Trammell, down, down, down. Sam Abbo again, Trump 2024. Okay, let's see here. Michael Luzewski, destroying our oil independence is the sole cause of Biden's destruction. Close our borders and arm America because of the war Biden has caused and the collapse of economies all across the world. We clearly are in a destabilized situation right now, economically, particularly following COVID and the massive amount of money that we printed. Again, we printed more than $6 trillion of M2 money supply. We borrowed about that much. We actually there's been more than 7.5 trillion of new Treasury debt since COVID. And so there was massive dislocation there. So you had too much money, and then we had the production halts and the economic lockdowns in 2020. And then the economy reopened much faster than anticipated. But at that point, you had too much money chasing too few goods. You have a continued supply chain crisis that comes out of COVID when you temporarily forestall production, and then 6 months later you're trying to ramp production back up because the economy's reopening much faster. And then Russia invades Ukraine in February of 2022. Let's see here. Sam Abbo, put Trump back and end the pandemic corruption. Frederick Trammell, I am paying double and more for groceries in New York City. Hey man, you're not kidding. It's not just in New York City. The prices are up everywhere. Let's see here. Melissa Manning, the Republicans are too busy bandstanding in court, something they should have done years ago. Too little, too late. Thanks for nothing, Republicans. You're letting our country fall into peril. Bravo. Terry Ballard, President Trump, MAGA. Here we go. Jim Durst, we need to make imports from China become illegal. They've been in the process of destroying our country for a while with the blessings of the Biden administration, I might add. Yeah, so we have a situation where in the late 1990s, under the Clinton administration, China was granted most favored trading status. And then in 2000 and 2001, they were led into the World Trade Organization. And since then, they've vastly expanded their exports to the United States, and they've used currency manipulation, again, by weakening the yuan. They use a peg of the yuan. They keep it artificially cheaper than the dollar, cheaper than it otherwise would be. I mean, they got way many more people than we do, so you expect it to be a bit weaker than the dollar. But leaving that aside, they've been able to exert trade advantage, increase their market share. For example, I just did a piece today about how China pretty much has a run of the mill on the U.S. antibiotics market. We don't make very many antibiotics anymore. There's only one U.S. company. It's called U.S. Antibiotics that makes amoxicillin in this country at all. So there's about 4 major manufacturers of penicillin worldwide. 3 of them are in China. But you could just grow penicillium in like your kitchen or something. Like, it's actually not that hard to make penicillin. It's inexcusable that we wouldn't make it here. But clearly they have a lot. What they do is they'll artificially make the yuan cheaper, and they'll take these cheaper products, in this case antibiotics, they dump them into U.S. markets. And then they're much cheaper. And then the U.S. companies go out of business, and then they jack up the prices. It's a pretty, pretty sinister, insidious thing to do. Cindy Smith, President Trump has warned us that if Biden was elected, we would have higher gas prices and inflation would go through the roof. He was right. Trump was right again. Let's see. Ronnie Cornelius. Why people do not see that President Trump was and is the best president this country ever had is because our elected officials have allowed the corrupt media and education system to brainwash the people. This is true and always will be true, even if you don't believe it. I think President Trump did a fantastic job. I personally supported him in the 2016 primary. And I've, of course, voted for him both in 2016 and 2020. I think he was a very strong president when it comes to the issue of trade. He knew how to talk to China. I think he knew how to talk to Russia. I think he knew how to engage in the international politics of deterrence. And that creates a strong foreign policy. And we're respected by both allies and our adversaries. It's peace through strength. That was Reagan's mantra, but that's really actually an old Roman kind of principle that to prevent war, you basically prepare for war, and then nobody will mess with you. I mean, that's a pretty simple, strong fences make for good neighbors. I think something goes like that. Sam Abbo, President Trump is always right. Patricia Alton. So the Biden people don't even speak of it or are either ignoring it, hoping it goes away, or they don't care which is it. In my opinion, China has one goal and the Dems have played right into their hands since Trump left. Thank you, Patricia. Here we go. Frederick Trammell again. Thank you, Frederick, for listening and tuning in. We don't make anything. We have to build plants, factories, and infrastructure first. They screwed us. I agree. We have had a hollowing out of our industrial base. It's not just antibiotics that we don't make anymore. We could be making finished goods here in the United States, but we just kind of choose not to. We've exported these factories, and you want to have good trade relations, I think, with countries in the world, but they don't have to eat our lunch. That's what Trump said about Biden. He ate your lunch. And I think a year later, Biden was actually agreeing, saying, if we don't do something, China's going to eat our lunch. I wonder if he was just remembering the debate and what Trump had said and was saying, oh, maybe Trump was right. And then here's Jane Knight Flanagan, Sam Abbo, about everything, saying Trump is right. He's right about everything. Michael Lozewski, Melissa Manning, your leftist propaganda put us here. Every policy and mandate against our own country, including oil drilling, crippled everything oil was running this country and others smoothly. Facts. There is a chain reaction from that, and the nincompoop running this country did that without anything put in its place first to ease the burden. Facts. Okay. And then Melissa Manning, she's going to defend herself. Michael, I'm a Republican. Yes, the left has screwed us royally, but the Republicans have sat back and watched. I think this is why Trump got the nomination in 2016 in the first place. Republicans have been, I don't know, Trump called them the forgotten men and women of America. He used trade as an example, but also immigration, the failure to protect the border, the failure to protect American working class citizens and middle class. I think that people feel that the Washington, D.C. establishment does not represent them. And President Trump was saying, I will speak to you directly. I will represent you directly. That this is the way we are going to be a strong country again, is that you're going to have true representation in the White House. I will represent you. That was Trump's pitch to first Republican voters and then more broadly to the American people after he got the nomination. And it helped him on the issue of trade and immigration to secure union household votes in states like Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. That put him over the top in the Electoral College, also Wisconsin, this Rust Belt area where a lot of our factories and things that we used to make in this country, they represented the hollowing out. The fact that those were the states that polled for Trump tells you how powerful his message on China, but also competing with China and therefore trade with China and potentially the need for tariffs. Trump did levy major tariffs on China that the Biden administration, President Biden, has not seen fit to fully lift. He's left the Trump tariffs in place. Like, gee, I wonder why he's doing that. Why is Biden continuing the Trump policy on trade? It's because if he tries to remove the tariffs, he'll lose a lot of leverage with China, but it will just it'll make him look weak and like he's giving in to China. So he knows Trump's going to run again. So why would you start undoing the Trump policies that were very popular and got him elected in the first place? Let's see here. Mary and Severs. Add the fact that we have 0.4% CO2 at 0.2% plant life dies. We clearly have no climate crisis. We have Sam Abbo. I agree. I always criticize the Republicans. They are very weak or politics. Michael Lazuski. They are doing everything they can, defending themselves with lies and destabilizing the Democratic Party. And Americans need to get out and demand the 25th. Unless in 2024 we control both the House and the Senate, there won't be an end to the corruption and destruction. So this is questioning how well, say, Trump gets the nomination, how well might he do in 2024? Well, to win the White House, does he need to win the popular vote? Well, Republicans haven't won the popular vote since 2004. But despite not winning the popular vote in 2000, they were still able to, get the House of Representatives. In 2016, Trump didn't win the popular vote, but he still had the House of Representatives. So if Trump were to win in 2024 against Biden or whoever the Democrat nominee is, would it be likely that they keep the House? I would think so. It would be tough to win the White House and not still hold on to the House. Whereas if Biden wins re-election, it seems likely that the Democrats will reclaim the House because the Republicans only need to lose 5 seats. So if Biden's going to win the popular vote and he's going to get reelected, then yeah, Democrats are probably going to have the House and I guess still the Senate. So could you get the House, the Senate, and the White House in order to be an effective administration? Democrats, going back to FDR, every time they win the White House in the first term of a new administration, they always win the House and the Senate. Trump did it in 2016. He got the White House, the House, and the Senate. George W. Bush, he was going to do it. And then Jim Jeffords switched parties. And so it wasn't until later in his administration that he got all 3 chambers. So Bush was able to do it. Reagan actually never had the House of Representatives. He wins the White House against Jimmy Carter in 1980, but he doesn't win the House, but he does win the Senate. They picked up a number of Senate seats. So there is a tendency to accumulate one or both houses of Congress should a president be entering into a new administration, knocking out the incumbent party, in this case, the Democrats. Here we go on. Melissa Manning. Sam Abbo, it's right on the verge of changing from destroying to destroyed. Talking about the, the country or the Democrat Party. Everyone's going back and forth here. Let's see. We'll skip that one. Climate change. It's not the topic of the day. My biggest 2 worries is the Second Amendment being attacked and the digital dollar. So you have the central bank digital currency. So under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, Congress has the power to coin money, to basically issue the currency and to set up the laws under which we do so. If you take into account also Article 1, Section 8, make all laws that are necessary and proper to bring into execution the foregoing powers. This is meant to mean that to apply to not just coins, but also paper money, and the currency that is issued by the, it was the First National Bank and then the Second National Bank, and eventually you get to the Federal Reserve. And so Congress sets forward the terms and conditions for what the currency is, and they have not authorized a central bank digital currency. Now, can the Federal Reserve, under either an executive order or just of its own authority, research what that is? How would you do a crypto dollar or something like that, given the advent of cryptocurrencies? Yeah, I guess so. It doesn't really matter if they study it or talk about it. I suppose they could issue a recommendation, but it would still be up to Congress to either probably just ignore that, because the idea that you have a Republican House and a Democrat Senate, that they're going to somehow agree on ending the paper money system in our country, for a central bank digital currency. It would probably take an administration to have supermajorities to pull that off. It's extremely controversial. If the Fed tries to do it all by itself, the Supreme Court will just overturn it. Therefore, they won't do it, because therefore it would be very destabilizing of financial markets for the Fed to suddenly claim authority. Jerome Powell has basically already ruled this out, saying that we're not going to try to interpret our own authority in order to say we're just going to have a central bank digital currency. I know this is a popular topic. The fact that they're talking so much about it, I think, why would they want a central bank digital currency? Probably to prevent bank runs. If there's no cash, then there's nothing to withdraw from the bank, right? So then you can't have bank runs anymore, something like that. But you could have a perverse incentive then to just have everything be in digital cash. Especially, if you deem other assets to be more risky at that point. And so there's a reason why deposit insurance only goes up to, say, $250,000, is because if it was unlimited, if you had unlimited deposit insurance, there would be a perverse incentive to just hold cash in bank accounts and then not use it for anything. Don't go purchase anything. Don't buy equities. Don't buy stocks. And so you get a kind of an illiquid system out of that. So it's all about incentives. I think central bank digital currency is a really, really bad idea. I'm not happy that the Fed is talking about it and saying that it would be ideal if Congress were to act, implying that they could act on their own. But at the same time, the chairman has ruled out acting on its own. So I think it would be an extreme power grab, extremely destabilizing, and almost certainly likely to be struck down by the 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court. So while it's a danger, it's one that would require participation by Congress in order to in order for it to really come to the fore here. Let's see. Michael Lobzewski. Biden has been selling out America and its secret documents his entire career. He said on national television so himself. Most didn't recognize it, but go back and watch every speech very carefully. Brenda Berner. We need Trump now. U.S. Trump took a 5% inflation rate from 2008 crash to 1.5%. Facts. Now it's back to 6.7. Actually, BLS just came out with the latest numbers. The 12-month rolling average is 5%. A month ago, it was 6%. And then I think a month before that, it was 6.7%. So it's actually, the inflation is coming down from its peak. It was at 9.1% in June of 2022. Now it's all the way down to 5%. Typically, what happens, though, as inflation goes down, this indicates that demand is weakening. And that's usually a tell on the recession, that you're about to see an uptick in unemployment. So there's an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. When inflation is dropping, or if you get deflation, unemployment's going to go up. And so I think the right now you're at about 3.5, 3.6 unemployment rate. The Federal Reserve is predicting about a 4.6% unemployment rate in 2024 by the end of the year. That implies that about 2 million Americans are going to lose their jobs between now and election day in 2024. If Biden was trying to forestall the end of the business cycle, he would have been better off politically if they had, and so would the country for that matter, if the Fed had been increasing the interest rates in 2021 as the inflation was rising. Instead, they waited all the way until the end of 2021 into 2022, when inflation had reached 7.5% already, and at the time when Russia invaded Ukraine. And then only when did Russia invade Ukraine did they say, we're going to start we're going to start increasing the interest rates. All right, let's see here. Um, Linda Hagen Shipley. Can y'all spell depression? Let's see. Depression. Yes. Could you get a depression out of a complete collapse of the dollar, or would you see deflation? Would you see inflation? If you're thinking the dollar is going to become much much weaker, that's usually inflationary. And so you don't want the dollar to be too strong. You don't want it to be too weak. If it's too strong, you can get deflation. If it's too weak, you can get inflation. So you want what they call price stability. And I think that's what we had under Trump, FJB, Paul Franks. Thank you, Paul. Villiers, Michael, Jacob. Vote Trump in 2024. I am. Sam Abbo, they are continuing. So it's the right paragraph. The only way to get our country back is to get rid of Biden because of Hunter. They're destroying it. It won't end. Michael Lazuski, hasn't America had enough destruction when Democrats win? It's happening over and over again in my lifetime. We have a two-party system, and there's basically two options, Republicans and Democrats right now. And you're going to see periodic shifts of power, which means that Republicans will have opportunities, as they did under Trump, to implement policies that they prefer. And when Democrats are in control, they can implement policies that they prefer. Obviously, we don't live in a strict democracy or, you have checks and balances. We don't have a unicameral legislature. We have a bicameral legislature. So actually passing laws is very, very difficult. Biden has actually been a rather weak president when it comes to legislation. I'm sure there were a lot of things that they were hoping to be able to accomplish, but because of their slim majorities in the House and the Senate, in 2021 and 2022, they were unable to, for example, abolish the filibuster. And then from there to pack the Supreme Court. I'm sure they wanted to pack the Supreme Court or implement the Green New Deal. They did the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a lot of green subsidies in there, but they didn't get nearly what they wanted on even the Green New Deal. Puerto Rico, DC statehood, that was on the table. Didn't happen. HR 1, there was going to be this big federalization of state election laws that didn't occur because they didn't have the votes. And so, Biden is actually, not too much to write home about headed into 2024 when it comes to legislation. In fact, it was the weakest majorities since before. You have to go back before FDR for a president who had such weak majorities headed into their first term. I think maybe Grover Cleveland or something like that. The last time a Democratic president had such weak legislative, support in Congress for their agenda. Which means that they're not going to get that much done in the way of legislation. I'd say we're all much better off for that. That Trump ran as strongly as he did in 2020. Republicans actually picked up a number of seats in the House of Representatives in 2020, although they didn't win the popular vote in the House of Representatives, or else they would have gotten a majority of the seats that year. But suffice to say, they nipped at the Democrats' 2018 majority to such an extent that it was very, very close. If Trump had won, it was a good possibility he would have also taken back the House of Representatives. He would have been the first president since Truman to do that. Now it might be Biden who ends up being the first president to reclaim the House of Representatives in a re-election bid after losing it in the midterm. Since Truman. You have to go back to Truman getting reelected, and then he reclaimed the House of Representatives after Democrats had lost it briefly after World War II. Could Biden reclaim the House of Representatives in 2024? If he gets reelected, I'd say probably a pretty good bet. Let's see, moving on here. Keith Malik. I buried my brother in New York last year, murdered by China manufactured bioweapon COVID, gain of function research funded by not just Democrats, but by the U.S. government, then discontinued for optical purposes. They actually put a moratorium on the on the so-called gain of function research, but they allowed the existing gain of function research by EcoHealth and others to continue. At the time. So there was never a ban on this. There was a moratorium on more funding going forward by the HHS and the federal government for these grants. But we spent a lot of money over there at the Wuhan lab. And if this was a lab accident or something like that, could taxpayer dollars have been funding the creation or at least the administration of this virus in that lab? It seems quite possible, and that it's really sad. Millions and millions of people have died all over the world, and it's really really sad that what happened with COVID and what a tragedy it is. And China could have been much, much more forthcoming about what happened at the Wuhan lab. Even the World Health Organization was forced to admit that China was not being forthcoming about that. And in the time since then, obviously, there's these U.S. intelligence assessments now that say that a lab leak or something like that is extreme, is highly, or I don't know, most likely, even if they say it's with like low or medium confidence. That's just intelligence community jargon. And now these intelligence reports should be coming forward. We'd like to see those declassified. I'd like to see the sourcing on that. Like, is this just the analysts who are taking the lay of the land and saying, well, it seems more likely than not that this came from the lab? I mean, it's like, well, we kind of knew that already. Do they have hard evidence of who was responsible at the lab and things like that? I want to see the evidence for where this thing came from. I think everyone does. It's like everyone's been speculating for years. And is Biden merely throwing out these intelligence assessments to say, yeah, we're in on the speculation game too? We can't prove it, but here's all this information about the lab that we think shows more likely than not that this is something that happened at the lab. I mean, it seems likely, but show it to us. If you have evidence, they should be forthcoming with evidence. Millions of people have died all over the world. I think the world and the American people, most of all, have a right to know what the government knows about this. What does it know about the how much of our research was used at the lab? Like, that's the information that I think could be conducted on oversight, frankly. They should get Echo Health in to testify. I don't care if they're not U.S. citizens. I think the people who were taking this money from the federal government and doing business at the Wuhan lab, they're the ones who have the most of the information that I think we would need. Like, a lot of attention is given to Dr. Fauci, but what about the doctors at Echo Health who were taking these grants? Yes, we granted the money. We can look up the grants. That's important. But the person who knows the most about the grant is not necessarily the one who granted it. It's the person who administered it. It's Echo Health. Echo Health knows everything that there is to know about this. The doctor in charge of it said that he had, like 100 novel coronaviruses in the lab. That refers to Wuhan. So I think that could the COVID-19 have been one of those? That's what we need to find out. So you might not even need to go to Wuhan itself at the lab. You just bring in the Echo Health people, and they'll be able to tell you what they know about this. And I think they have a perverse incentive to kind of be in denial. Like, say you were the doctor working on that, or you worked at Echo Health, and then COVID gets out and you're embarrassed by it. So you go into like a state of denial or something. You don't want to believe that it had been you who had caused the deaths of millions and millions of people, because it's one or the other, right? Either this came from the lab and it could have been caused by the lab, therefore, or it was actually, they were just doing the right research in the right place at the right time. Like, this thing was going to pop up anyways, and this is the type of research we want to do. So it's just a question of like, should we be doing this kind of research? Is it too dangerous? If you can show that this was a lab accident, then maybe, yeah, it is too dangerous. On the other hand, if this was just something that came up in the wild and there's a way to show that, then you might favor the research more. So just from a policy perspective, you want to know if this was a screw up at the lab, because it would tell you whether or not this type of research is either too dangerous, or maybe is necessary, or both. Maybe you need this kind of research just to prevent something when something does go wrong at one of these labs, or just if one of these things pops up in the wild, that you still need to understand what these viruses are. And so there are policy considerations there. Obviously, China, I think they do have the information and they could be more forthcoming. And I think the American people and the president, whether it's Biden or Trump, they should be demanding that information. And, I mean, it's not as if we don't have some tools to confront China with. Trump had tools to confront China with, to bring them to the table. And it was tariffs. They don't like the tariffs. When you raise tariffs on Chinese goods and you say, let's come to the table and let's talk about what's going on at the lab, you force disclosures. It's like, oh, well, all right, the tariffs just went up another 20%. You don't want to cooperate. I think that's how Trump might be dealing with this right now, and certainly how Biden could be dealing with it right now. Biden doesn't want to get tough on China. I mean, that's his business. We're happy to see that most of the tariffs that Trump put into place are still there, though. We think it's a good policy to keep those tariffs up there. Anna Stewart, we are going to have items unavailable soon when China invades Taiwan. Yeah, antibiotics. Most of the antibiotics are made in China. And that's something that definitely needs to be addressed. Congress should be, they've had plenty of years to, think about this. Certainly by the time COVID came around, everyone knew that we were over dependent on pharmaceuticals from China and India and other places. And that when global production is shutting down during the pandemic, is something similar could happen in the event of a war, where you could have a global distribution and supply chains that are taxed or disrupted because of conflict. And so, if we're anticipating pandemics, if we're anticipating conflict, then having more of essential production for things like medicine and antibiotics and other things, that rare earth minerals that we need for defense production, things like that. We should be insourcing those things as much as possible. Trump was right. America first. We need to do it here in America, especially for these essential goods. Like if China flooded U.S. grain markets with wheat or something and then put all the farms out of business, would we say, oh, well, China controls 80% of the wheat production that we used to have, and so we have to import it from China? It's like, no, we don't. We can grow our own food. We can make our own penicillin. It's not even, the person who discovered penicillin was by accident in a petri dish because he had a runny nose. You could grow penicillium in your kitchen just by letting your bread go moldy or something. The idea that we can't manufacture penicillin in this country is embarrassing. It's inexcusable. And why would you want one or two countries to have a monopoly on life-saving medicines, especially if they could be potentially militaristic or a dangerous adversary? I think that having, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, you want divisions of labor, so you want division of production. When it comes to things like this, you want to have things that we can make here in America. Thank goodness U.S. Antibiotics was bailed out, pulled out of bankruptcy by Jackson Healthcare. They're based in Bristol, Tennessee. They're the only U.S. manufacturer of amoxicillin right now, and there's amoxicillin shortages reported by the FDA coming before the October 2020, before the cold and flu season had really, really ramped up here. Let's see here. Michael Luzinski, China should send that $1 trillion back to Biden sent and allow them months later to buy from our oil reserves with. That's shady. Charles McGowie. Will the government start interning Chinese people like the Japanese in World War II? Doubtful. You can't just round people up and put them into camps. I think we have a constitution that is not suspended in times of war, even if that's things that we've done in the past. So I think that there would be extreme constitutional issues with that. But I mean, it's very simple, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, no person shall be, Fifth Amendment, no person shall be deprived of liberty without due process of law. Now, if someone's actually an enemy agent or something like that, like a spy or even like an actual soldier or something who's invading, the protections don't extend there. Because those are actual enemy combatants or something like that. So they would apply to military law in that context. But just taking regular citizens and putting them into camps, that seems unconstitutional to me and probably unnecessary, just from a military standpoint. The evidence, the people who funded it, who created it. Well, you do research in these labs, and then they can mutate these viruses to learn more about them. So you would say, if you're doing that type of research, you would do that on purpose. So it stands to reason, if it came from the lab, if it was a man-made virus, yeah, I mean, there should be a way to show that, though. If all the government can do is speculate and fuel more speculation about this, then it's just a political CYA by the Biden administration to say, yeah, we're on top of this. Maybe they just read a poll, and the poll said most people believe that this thing may have come from the lab. So they just favored putting out intel assessments on that to make themselves look good and make it look like they were on top of it without actually having to prove it or to put any pressure on China. Especially if the intelligence is weak. Would that put pressure on China to put out a weak intelligence assessment? So I hope they have really good proof, because then we can use that to put pressure on China. If they don't have good evidence, well, then they should have done a better job of trying to source this. Maybe get Echo Health into Congress to testify, or heck, the FBI could go get them. Let's see. Cindy Smith, the government was very smart and evil when they shut down the country. People sat at home, and even if they didn't believe the BS at first, all people did was watch TV, the same news over and over again, and then the majority were brainwashed. So the lockdowns were psychologically, I know, very impactful upon children who were not allowed to go to school, weren't allowed to socialize, and that this is going to have years long impact on education and on kids particularly. But they were paying people to stay home. So then they got to do a trial run on things like universal basic income. They got a trial run on Green New Deal. See, they were actually studying how much did carbon emissions lessen during COVID, because people were driving less, there were fewer planes in the air, and so forth. So there was a lot of, I think, really harmful impacts. It certainly impacted the elections, because you had more mail-in ballots that were used during the election, which helped Biden to win. If it had just been a regular turnout, go vote at the polls, I think, and there was no COVID, I think Trump would have easily been reelected. He was certainly on that trajectory, a very strong economy. It would have been surprising for Biden to overcome just those factors that Trump was he was still popular with his base. You had a successful economy, you had low inflation, low unemployment. All those factors added up to re-election, and then COVID struck, and suddenly unemployment wasn't low anymore. Suddenly 25 million people had lost their jobs. For that reason alone, it would have been very difficult for Trump to get reelected with a recession that massive. I don't think any president would have been able to overcome that, except Trump almost did. Trump lost by a scant 10,000 votes in Georgia, 10,000 in Arizona, 23,000 in Wisconsin, 43,000 votes in 3 states. If they had gone the other way, the Electoral College would have actually been tied 269 to 269. And just think of that, 43,000 votes, like that's a Trump rally. With 2 more Trump rallies, and then maybe that would have gone the other way. Let's see, climate crisis. Got on national television screaming hate. I don't know what that's about. Let's see here. Jimmy Woodward. When will Congress wake up and hold Biden accountable for his failure to protect the United States of America? Good question. It's not speculation who has funded it. They are responsible. Yes, the federal government, Departments of Health and Human Services, NIH, USAID had a big grant that went to the Wuhan Institute. It went through Echo Health. Yes, we know that. We know that they funded it. Nobody's questioning whether they funded it. The question is, from a policy perspective, do you continue doing that kind of research? And you need to know whether or not this was a lab accident. You need to know, can you even create medicines to fight viruses like this if you're not doing this kind of research? There's an actual discussion, from a policy standpoint. Do you want to ban it? Do you want to ban this type of research into viruses? These are questions Congress needs to know the answers to so that it can formulate laws and policies, and then the executive branch can issue regulations that can address this and make it more safe. Should it be the subject of a treaty, considering how potentially dangerous this type of research is? So should we be talking to other countries about this and formulating, I don't know, international agreements to make certain you could put International Atomic Energy Agency style protocols on this type of research to make it safer if it is going to exist, or if you're banning it, then therefore to have international mechanisms to monitor it. So yeah, we need the answers to these questions. I suppose we can make policy based upon the speculation of the intelligence agencies saying something is more likely than not. We certainly go to war on that basis. I just don't know if it's a sound basis for really formulating policies. When the intelligence agencies tell you something, for example, President Trump is a Russian agent, and his campaign was colluding with Russia to steal the 2016 election and take the DNC emails and put them onto WikiLeaks. Do we believe it at face value just because the intelligence agencies or the FBI alleged that? Just because there was the fact that they got a FISA warrant against Carter Page and the Trump campaign? I'll tell you, I didn't believe it for a minute. Not for a minute, not for 2 seconds. It seemed like a lie at the time, and then as soon as it was becoming public, it was easily disproven. So the Steele dossier that actually was funded by the Hillary Clinton campaign, it wasn't an intelligence document. It wasn't some government intelligence assessment. It was a hit piece written by the Clinton campaign and a former British spy, Christopher Steele, via Fusion GPS. And they put this hit piece out there, and it said all sorts of nonsense in there about Paul Manafort and Carter Page, and even Michael Cohen was supposedly traveling to Prague to meet with Russian agents after the Trump campaign had supposedly helped to get the emails onto WikiLeaks out of the DNC. And then it turned out that Michael Cohen was up immediately. He's like, I didn't even go to Prague. I've never been to the Czech Republic. Here's my passport. And he kind of proved that the dossier was fake right at the beginning of this whole nonsense. So just because the intelligence agencies tell you what you want to hear, question the messenger. Joe Biden's the president right now. It serves his political interests to talk about the Wuhan lab and act like he's getting tough with China. If he's got evidence that this thing came out of the Wuhan lab, the American people have a right to see it. Millions of people have died worldwide. They should show the evidence. They should be going to the United Nations. They should be going to the World Health Organizations, and they should be demanding that this information, be further expounded upon. They're just going to put out these documents and just say it was more likely than not, but not show any evidence. That doesn't put pressure on China. And that's a problem. And I don't want to serve the political agenda of a president who's trying to make himself look tough. I have no use for that. If you're going to be tough and in the American interest, then I'll support it. But if you're going to put out weak statements and bogus assessments and not be able to back up your work and show your sources to show how you know something, I mean, you might have to declassify some of that, Mr. President. I'm sorry, but if they know that for a fact and they're withholding it, and then they're going to say, oh, that's all redacted and we can't show you the evidence. I'm sorry, that does not make a public case. When the Kennedy administration needed to put pressure on the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they proved in front of the United Nations with the intelligence that they were putting the missiles into Cuba, and that did put pressure. So if you want to have that kind of Adlai Stevenson moment at the UN with the Wuhan lab, go for it, Mr. President Biden. Go for it. Put that information out there, but better dot your I's and cross your T's, or it might not be that credible. Then it might not put pressure on China. And then what's the point? Politics. That's the point. Betty Mary Kerr, when they're no longer in power. That is treason. Hillary and trying to overthrow any president with pure BS treason. The Russiagate hoax was designed to kneecap the Trump administration before it had even taken office. It was to cast aspersions on it. If you just follow the trail of where it came from and and where it went. You had a FISA warrant in the fall of 2016 on the Trump campaign. This FISA warrant, therefore, surveillance on Carter Page, but contacts of Carter Page, but also contacts of Carter Page, would have netted, I think, much of the Trump campaign, but also people that Carter Page had been in touch with. But in any event, that surveillance gets carried over into the Trump transition. Trump wins the election. Do they end the surveillance and say, this is a bad idea, guys? We're going to get caught. This is not real. Or what do? They carried it over into the Trump administration after he'd been sworn into office. And then they lied about it to Congress. James Comey, we're not investigating President Trump, and they were investigating President Trump, who ended up firing Comey, and then they converted it into a special counsel investigation. I mean, what we've learned since then, I think, is if you really look at it, David Petraeus, he was the hero general of Iraq. He was the CIA director under Obama. He had a classified documents case pop up right after it was speculated that he might be running for president in 2016. And they knocked him off the table. It's like, oh, you're not running for nothing. Classified documents case, and Petraeus is gone. Hillary Clinton had a classified documents case. Former President Trump has a classified documents case right now. The current sitting president, Biden, has a classified documents case. Why goodness, that's the last four actual and presidents or potential presidents have all had leverage brought upon them by the Justice Department and intelligence agencies with classified documents cases. In the case of Trump, bogus allegation that they were Russian agents or something like that. And so it seems that this is, and they certainly used it on Trump as leverage to get the attorney general to recuse himself. So Trump didn't have a real attorney general when he was in office. I think that the Justice Department and what was done to Trump, what it actually revealed, and Trump has declassified a ton of this stuff. He actually declassified a trove of the Russiagate documents right before he left office, and the Justice Department is still refusing to turn it over. Chuck Grassley and Ron Johnson have actually had letters into Merrick Garland, the attorney general, saying, hey, these documents were declassified. Why aren't you releasing them? And then I guess we found out when the FBI raided Trump's house in Mar-a-Lago, is that they just want to pretend like those documents were never declassified, even though Trump signed a declassification order, and then he put a special counsel on it. It seems like it's all designed to prevent the American people from having a say in elections. Rather, we're going to politicize the criminal justice system. We're going to politicize intelligence. We're going to politicize the Justice Department so that these executive agencies are going to be choosing who the president is and how effective that president is allowed to be, when the American people, under the Constitution and the Electoral College, we're the ones with the power to choose the president. So I think this really calls into question what type of government we're going to have going forward, and whether elections really matter to what type of systems we're going to have going forward here. My goodness, we've been going on for more than an hour here. Let's see here. Let's see, 4 years, Loziski says. Let's see. Levon Thornton, exactly the way it was planned to release it, a deadly pandemic, mandated shutdown. I don't know if it was intentional or not. I think you just have to kind of go with facts, like talk about things that you know. Speculation is that's what we're getting from Biden right now. That's the speculations that lead to these bogus allegations. So when the intelligence agencies are telling you something, you should question, how do they know that? And is it real? And, so we can make informed policy decisions and not be led around by the noses by an executive branch that has an interest in frankly, in supporting itself. There's a political self-interest at play when we consider how Biden is treating the Wuhan lab potential origin of the virus. We should, do we trust China? No. But do we trust the federal government to get these assessments correct? Weapons of mass destruction, anyone? Now, maybe Saddam Hussein had time to get the weapons of mass destruction out of Iraq right before the Iraq War. Or maybe he got rid of them 10 years earlier and that most of them have been destroyed and our intelligence wasn't that good. So yeah, intelligence can be it could be wrong, it could be manipulated, and I'm just saying that Biden getting involved with the Wuhan lab leak, if he can prove it, that would be frankly amazing. That would be very, very important. It would serve a very important, I think, diplomatic function. It would support our national security. And I think it would help to better inform the public policy decisions that Congress needs to make about whether this type of research is either necessary on one hand or just too dangerous on the other. So I think we need to have accurate information about that. Let's see, just a couple more chats here. Lavin Willoughby. Joe Biden's communism has destroyed the United States of America. Don't wake up and take Joe Biden and Obama, Clinton's Democrats before they completely destroy the United States. Listen, I follow this page, lots of info. Thank you for that. And thank you for everyone who was tuned in today. Again, China is dumping $150 billion of U.S. Treasuries. Is this is their economy weak? Do they need the cash for other things? Are they using it to funnel the money into them directly into their military? Are they about to make a play on Taiwan? If so, why haven't they drawn down their treasuries all the way to zero? Because if they act on Taiwan, if they invade Taiwan, we're just not going to pay that debt. We're going to repudiate those obligations. One more chat here. Let's see. Michael Loziski, look at the situation itself. Our government is not working for the American people. Its own crookedness is what everyone is seeing. President Trump has the protection and the right with all the evidence to declare the 25th. You mean the 25th Amendment? President Trump can't declare the 25th Amendment. That would be the cabinet of the the executive branch. They could do that. You're going to have an election just next year. President Trump says he's running. So there'll be opportunities to vote for him in the primaries. There'll be an opportunity, should he be nominated, to vote for him in the general election, assuming that the Democrats are not going to lock him up or something. Obviously, imprisoning your political opponents right before an election is very provocative. I think it's unconstitutional. I think it certainly has no place in our republic. We can't have rogue prosecutors or justice departments or intelligence agencies taking matters into their own hands. This is the violence of faction that James Madison warned us about in Federalist Number 10. Frankly, the framers never supported a personal right to revolution or anything like that. And so you certainly wouldn't want it in the hands of individual government officials to act in that way, to try to imprison political opponents or use acts of force, using law like that. That is an act of force. And it's dangerous to do that to presidential candidates. But again, we just noted that Petraeus, Clinton, Trump, Biden, they've all had these documents cases that seems to be more like a system of leverage. So hopefully President Biden, who still happens to be in the White House, is not too distracted by things like that and is able to focus on his job and in deterring China and to keep that deterrence up so that we're not going to have a much wider conflict that I fear, as President Trump was warning on Truth Social, could lead to World War III. And with that, we've got a couple more chats here. Lazuski, it's our Constitution that protects the American people, not the government. That is exactly right. That's exactly where I want to end this. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications. Check us out on dailytorch.com and have a good day.